Hi. Before we enter into the text of 2 Samuel 2, I thought it would be helpful to do a little introduction to this unit, 2 Samuel 2 1 to 5 5, as you can see on the right side of the screen, and also see how this unit fits into the larger picture of 2 Samuel. Because, as we showed in the introductory video to the whole book of 2 Samuel, one way of looking at the way the pieces of 2 Samuel fit with the pieces of 1 Samuel and with the larger Deuteronomistic history from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings is in this timeline chart that I have here, which suggests that these units in each box are written at a different time period, the time period roughly along the timeline there, and eventually consolidated at some later point, and certainly no earlier than the end of exile here in the 6th century BC, but by some dates, especially the minimalists, way down in Hellenistic era, and they're suggesting the entire thing is composed post-exile in this period, that nothing is from before here. So apart from those arguments among scholars which rage unabated today and have no more consensus now than they had maybe 50 or 100 years ago, and perhaps less than they did 100 years ago, how do we make sense of how the book of 2 Samuel fits together as a book itself? Because that's what we have. And I showed in the introductory video some of the parallels between how 1 Samuel is shaped and 2 Samuel is shaped, but we haven't really looked at how 2 Samuel is shaped itself. So although in a couple of videos I showed the overall structure of the three poems, the one that we just looked at in 2 Samuel 1, along with Hannah's song in 1 Samuel 2, and David's poem in 2 Samuel 22 near the end, those are sort of pillars upon which the whole thing is based. We're going to have to look a little more closely to see how the unit we're about to enter fits with the bigger picture. So let's begin by looking at the shape of these chapters. And almost all scholars agree that this is a unit because it begins with David anointed king of Judah, right at the beginning in this unit here, which you can see on the left side of the screen right there in 2:4. And then it ends with David appointed king over Israel and this unity between Judah and Israel over the monarchy. What some scholars, at least historically, used to call the united monarchy is if that was the norm and the division that happened after is some kind of exception, perhaps parallel to the image that many of us carry about the United States as a nation. If it had come out differently after the Civil War and there had been several hundred years of a northern states and a southern states as separate nations, I wonder how we'd feel about that idea that the United States was the plan all along. Because certainly, as we'll see, there's no particular plan that suggests that Israel and Judah would ever be one people or one polity by on any basis other than perhaps a common worship of Yahweh, which is ultimately not the issue in the book here. What's the issue is a common loyalty to David, who has a loyalty to Yahweh, but that's a separate issue, whether the people are loyal to Yahweh or the people are loyal to the King David. And that very issue will come up in the post-exilic period when the question of Cyrus as the king of Persia, noted by Isaiah, or the author of Isaiah 45:1, as Yahweh's Messiah, who then authorizes in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, under the aegis of the scribe priest Ezra, to equate the law of God and the law of the human king, in that case the Persian king. So the idea that a king's word becomes the same as Yahweh's word, and you don't need Yahweh's word, goes back a long way, and we'll see the emergence of that later in our story. But what we have to look at now is how these chapters are shaped and how they fit into the bigger picture. So Saul is dead, we know that, and Jonathan is dead. And we know from 1 Samuel 8 that the means of gaining this king that the people want was to get one that Yahweh chose and the people affirmed, which says nothing about dynasty. There's nothing in the structure of 1 Samuel that suggested that when Saul died, Jonathan, his son, should be king. And for that matter, not his other sons, who we didn't really know about, but we're told died as well. And yet that seems to be the assumption, that dynasty is the default by which readers expect monarchy to proceed, even though that's explicitly not what happened. And it will be what does continue to happen. If we were to read the books of Kings, and I'll go through some of the books of Kings in this series, at least up to the rebellion of Jeroboam against Rehoboam, in the middle of 1 Kings, we'll see that after that it's just a given that the son of the king or one of the sons of the king becomes the next king, starting with Solomon and then proceeding with Solomon's son Rehoboam, where there's no sense of trying to go to Yahweh to pick somebody else. This is the only place we see where this is happening independently of dynasty, where David is a new force right away. And there are other places, of course, where dynasties end and they're replaced by somebody else, usually through some kind of war or assassination. But this is where Yahweh has explicitly called David to be the Messiah here, to be the anointed king. So how is he going to do that, given that there are still members of Saul's family alive? We don't know that any of the members of Saul's family have any desire to be king. We don't have any reason to think that the people of Israel want them to be king. But Abner wants Ishbal to be king, and so we'll see it starts there. And it will end at the in this section, in the end of first part of chapter 3, with the narrator talking about the war between the houses and the sudden injection there of the note of David having 6 sons from 6 women, even though we've only heard of 2 of those, and we've heard of the 2 of those, Ahinoam and Abigail, together throughout since 1 Samuel 25, when David acquired Abigail at the death of Nabal. So with that, then we get Abner's attempt to broker a covenant. Abner defects to David when Ishbal objects to Abner going into Saul's concubines, something that will be paralleled in the Absalom situation that's parallel we'll look at in a minute. And Abner makes a covenant with David, but Joab was out of the room and protests that. So just when it looked like maybe there was a peace a treaty between Abner on behalf of the House of Saul, although one could ask who made Abner the designated representative of the House of Saul. Why would it not be Ishbal, the king's son? But Abner's taking care of that and exerted the power. So they share a feast, but when Joab finds out, he goes to make sure that Abner is dead, and Abner is murdered, and Ishbal is murdered, and Ishbal's murderers are murdered, and that solves that problem, or at least it cleans it up a little bit, and David claims no responsibility for any of it. And so by the time we get there and David is anointed king over Israel, we're going to have several examples of whether we trust that David is as innocent as he seems, that all these convenient deaths that allow him to have untrammeled power over both Israel and Judah have taken place without his having anything to do with it. And when we look at these chapters, we often have to see there's some amazing links between this unit and a parallel unit in 2 Samuel 15 to 19. And here are a whole series of those around situations, around places, and around people. So we can see in both situations the king's son's commander, whether that's Abner or Amasa here, turns to support David and is killed by Joab. And of course both end with the death of the king's son, Ishbal and Absalom. Saul is not there to lament the death of his son Ishbal, but David is certainly there to lament the death of Absalom. And then 2 key places are named that are not elsewhere in 2 Samuel, or only one place elsewhere. And interestingly, both places are tightly connected with the book of Genesis and with Abraham. Abraham was in Hebron, and Mahanaim is the place, the double cave, or double camp rather, near where Mamre is, where the burial place is. The double cave is near the double camp. And it's also connected with Jacob. So we see these places connected with Genesis, and when we get to them, we'll look more closely at that. But they're only in these 2 units. So you see Hebron is 20 times in the unit we're about to enter into, and 4 times in the second one, but only 1 time elsewhere. Whereas Mahanaim, as you can see, is 3 times in chapter 2 and 3 times in the Absalom unit, and not elsewhere. Then there's another interesting piece, the role of the men or elders of Judah, only in this first part and then only in chapter 19. And that leads some scholars to see that contrary to what is usually assumed, that David has authority over Judah, but Israel was Saul's and he had to acquire that, and that was the sort of tail on the dog, so to speak. Some have suggested the exact opposite, that Judah only mentioned the beginning and only mentioned the end is more the tail on the dog, added perhaps later, and that rule over Israel was the main issue. And that's that kind of direction tends to see the story, as we note some do, as a pastiche of multiple sources. And that's only one way to see it. One can see it, as I'll show in a moment, as part of a larger narrative structure. And so we'll see throughout that these patterns that we see will lead some to see that the parts that match are from the same source and the parts in the middle are from some different source, and others to read it as a coherent unit. And then the so-called sons of Zeruiah, the three murdering assassins that worked for David, but David claims are too violent for me, and yet he doesn't get rid of them. He keeps them around. So that's something that certainly most scholars think is not a very sincere disclaimer. But they're there throughout in this first unit, and then they're there in the second unit, but only 4 times mentioned elsewhere. Given their importance, that's an unusual cluster. And then finally the Benjaminites. And the Benjaminites are named as a different unit than Israelites or Judahites. Ultimately, that's not the case. Ultimately, in the longer picture of the Bible, we simply think of the two polities as being Israel and Judah. But here, Benjamin or the Benjaminites are a separate unit. And Saul was a Benjaminite, and yet we noted that may well have been some of the Benjaminites who became the so-called fifth column that supported David and gave him information when they could see that Saul was losing his mind and was no longer reliable. So the Benjaminites play all kinds of different roles, and that echoes their ambiguous role in the book of Judges too. There are 6 times in this first unit and 3 times in the second unit, and only 3 times elsewhere. So what do we make of that? Well, to look at that, we have to look at the shape of the larger picture. And although I've color-coded this, it's not exactly a chiasm, although there certainly are some interesting parallels, but it doesn't match exactly like a chiasm. So it begins, as we've seen, with the death of Saul, the programmatic poem, and it ends not with the death of David, which doesn't happen until 1 Kings, but with another programmatic poem, the one that we looked at, and a couple of examples at the end of David dealing with miscellaneous crises, a famine and a census. And they're important to the larger picture, and most scholars see these, though, as some kind of postscript, chapters perhaps added later, and they certainly don't seem to follow the narrative, which reaches its climax at the end of chapter 20. So, as just noting here, there's this unit of David consolidating his reign against insiders, which is to say Saul and those people are fellow Yahweh people, and that makes them insiders. They're people of Israel, as opposed to the Amalekites or the Philistines or some of the other folks who are plainly outsiders. And that's parallel, as I was just noting, to Absalom's rebellion, which is also consolidating against insiders. So he begins by consolidating his reign against the insiders of the House of Saul, and then reconsolidates his reign against the insiders of his own house. And then it follows with Sheba's rebellion, which is sort of a hybrid. He's not exactly an outsider. He's not like the Amalekites, but he's also not an immediate part of the family. And there's an interesting parallel here between a wise woman who gives Joab advice here and the wise woman who gives Joab advice here about the unraveling of the house of David and what to do about Absalom. And then these rough parallels here, as we see after David is made king over both places, he consolidates his reign against outsiders, and we see a series of programmatic stories about his victory. But also, most importantly, we see in 2 Samuel 7, his prophet Nathan promising him as the word of Yahweh that someone from David's house would be on the throne in Jerusalem forever. And so David established in Jerusalem with no temple, but with a royal house. And that's where we reach the literal high point of the story, and it's worth listening to these 2 verses from chapter 11 that I've noted as a high point here. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And apart from the issue of bathing, because it may well have been that she was washing from her monthly period or some other ritual rather than taking a bath. We'll get to those details when we get there. But the point I was making is from the roof of his house. That's literally the high point. And he looks down from the roof of his house, and in that looking down, we know the infamous Bathsheba-Uriah situation. And even people like Robert Barron, who want to make David like Churchill or Lincoln, or like Adam or like Jesus, it seems to me, can't be approving of his having the woman he's having adultery with, his husband, murdered through deception. And so that's the relatively easy case. And as people like Brooke Halpern suggest, the writers leave that one hanging there so we can say, well, David was a fine guy other than the Bathsheba-Uriah situation, as a way of drawing attention away from all the ways that David disclaims responsibility for the other violence that happens around him. He can't disclaim responsibility for the death of Uriah quite so easily. So after that, we have the unraveling of the house of David from the inside. And that's, of course, not exactly parallel to the consolidating the reign against outsiders, but with the rape of his daughter Tamar by her half-brother Amnon, and her full brother Absalom's outrage at that, and David's refusal to respond to this struggle amongst the children whom he loves. We see Absalom begins a rebellion, which is exactly parallel to what we see with David consolidating his reign against Saul. And Absalom dies as Saul and Jonathan died, and David's reign is reconsolidated. And then we have the end, as we noted there. So that's the shape of our story. And as readers, they may have come from different sources, and there may be, as I was noting here, even conflicting points of view. And as I was noting in the introductory video, perhaps within this are different sources that had pro and anti-David or pro and anti-monarchy perspectives, which leads, as we read it as one unit, to sometimes ping-pong back and forth between different perspectives. I think that's part of the brilliance of it. Rather than seeing it as clumsy editing, especially as Germanic Christian writers did in the past, having implicit bias against the Jewish writers as not being as aesthetically capable as they are, I'd say exactly the opposite. It's the German scholars who didn't know how to read the Jewish writings because of their own prejudice, and that were only recently discovering the brilliant artistry of the final editors, if not the original authors, in creating such tightly woven text full of wordplay and a political acumen and insights about life and power and divinity on earth. So we'll continue with looking at chapter 2 as David inquires of Yahweh what he should do, and the story unfolds from there. See you for that next time.